Hello, and welcome to this very special April bonus episode of Beyond the Breakers. It's Taylor here, along with Tanner. We'll be doing something a little different. We'll be diving back into folklore, myths, mythology around maritime things. We each kind of brought a story to the table this month that we'll be talking about, interacting with, kind of looking over. Tanner, how you doing?
Good. We just recorded a big time episode
we
for
did.
The main feed, talking about the Estonia part 2 of our 2-part series.
It was a big series. It was definitely a requested one, but glad to have that one done.
Now let's do something fun.
Yeah, let's talk about something fun. That wasn't the most uplifting way to begin my Sunday morning.
Mm-hmm.
Well, mine's actually not fun, really, but that's fine.
Mine doesn't end well either. Actually, mine has 3 different sad endings, so...
Choose your sad ending.
Yeah.
Well, mine, I'll go ahead and start. I guess so. Mine is definitely a true story. You know, it's ghost ships and things like that are a huge part of maritime, like lore. You know, you hear a name like the Mary Celeste, and that's like a name that even people who aren't into maritime things, they know that name, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
What if I told you that there's another vessel with a sort of similar story, but it's all 100% true? There's nothing made up here. So this is the Carroll A Deering. Have you heard of that vessel before?
Maybe.
You've probably heard, we've probably talked about it. It's a fairly well-known myth in the Outer Banks area, the Cape Hatteras, Cape Lookout area.
I think I would have, if I had just heard that name, I probably would have guessed it was either a shipwreck or a ghost ship situation. But I don't know anything about it.
So let's talk about it. The Carroll A. Deering is a 5-masted schooner. She was launched April 4th, 1919 by the G.G. Deering Company in Bath, Maine.
5?
Yes, 5. 5 masts. She's a big schooner.
I didn't know that you could have 5 masts on a sailing ship.
But also, it's 1919, so keep that date in mind. This is one of the last of these things that's
like
being
a super
built.
Sailing ship.
Right. So she's named for the son of G.G. Deering. Her dimensions, she's 255 feet long. She has a beam of 44 feet. She normally carries a crew of 11. For the voyage we'll be talking about, her crew is going to be composed of various Scandinavian nationalities, and a majority of those being Danes.
I thought your notes said her crew is composed of various Scandinavian nationalists.
Well, I don't, that almost could be another theory when we get to the theory section on this thing. The composition of the crew does matter a little bit for this story, though, so just keep that in mind. They are not native English speakers, for the most part.
Okay.
She's a bit of a curiosity, like we already said. She's one of the last large sailing commercial vessels to be constructed. 1919, pretty much everything's becoming, steam powered. It's even oil fired and stuff. There's not a lot of sailing ships still around.
She's like basically the dreadnought of schooners.
So the schooner left Rio de Janeiro on December 2nd, 1920, under the command of Captain Willis Wormel, who by all accounts was an experienced sailor and navigator. So this guy has a lot of experience. He's in his 60s. He's done this before. He's not new to the game. She's bound for Barbados with a crew of 10 plus Captain Wormel. And for this trip, she's actually empty. She had already made a delivery in Rio, and now she's headed back north. She arrives at Barbados on January 9th, 1921. She restocks with supplies and awaits further orders.
Is this Barbados where the sugarcane grows taller than the god we once believed in?
According to Flocking Molly, yes.
Okay.
So when no orders came, she departs for Norfolk, Virginia. So she's going to come back north, look for more cargo, that kind of thing. The journey north proves to be uneventful until January 29th off the coast of North Carolina's Cape Lookout. It's an area that me and you are both very familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
While sailing at 5 knots, a crew member of the Deering signals the lightship stationed at Cape Lookout. This crew member states that the ship has lost both anchors and asks that it's reported to the owners of the vessel. The lightship took the information, but they're unable to transmit this due to the radio being broken. So it's kind of a weird interaction with the lightship. That's, it's not atypical to pass on information like that. But if you were truly, having an issue, you're not going to say, contact the owners of my company. You're going to be like, send the Coast Guard, please.
Yeah, someone who can help me right now.
Right.
Also, I guess just because it's something I've known about basically my whole life that I can remember, I've never really thought about the name Cape Lookout.
Uh-huh.
And I guess it's kind of like when we talk about places that are just like aptly named, like, Danger Point, or in the Benjamin Noble, we talked about Knife Island. And I guess here it's like, hey, look out.
Look out. Yeah, it's a known treacherous area. Like, I mean, it's a place that people are aware of, that this is a spot where there's a higher chance of running into an issue for a variety of reasons. So of note in this interaction, though, this man is not the captain of the Deering. He's a tall, thin man with red hair and a foreign accent. Almost like he's a Dane.
Sounds like a duplicitous Dane to me.
So the crew of the lightship also noted that the crew appeared to just be milling about on the quarterdeck, which is not an area they would normally be allowed in. So the quarterdeck is sort of like where the captain operates from. And really, it should only be like the captain and the mate and maybe like someone who's steering the ship. Like the whole crew shouldn't just be wandering around this area. They should be doing their job somewhere else.
Right.
That's not like a normal, like it was atypical enough that the crew of the lightship thought it was strange. So another potential sighting occurs on January 30th. Captain Henry Johnson of the SS Lake Elon, he sights a 5-masted schooner with 2 points on the bow. So that general description matches the Deering. This sighting occurred about 25 miles southwest of Diamond Shoal's light vessel. They would pass within half a mile of the mystery vessel, but could not read her name. From the position, direction of travel, and description, it's almost certain that Captain Johnson saw the Deering. Captain Johnson would go on to explain that there was nothing irregular or odd about the vessel except for one thing, its course. Captain Johnson stated that it seemed that the vessel was making a heading for Cape Hatteras. That's just not a location that you would be going to in that type of a vessel. There's no deep water ports. There's no cargo that you'd be picking up there. It's just an odd place that vessel would be going to.
Right.
This brings us to the morning of January 31st, 1921. A surfman by the name of C.P. Bradley was on lookout duty. He's doing his normal patrols. Best case scenario, you'll find nothing. Worst case, a body washes up and you know that you got a problem.
Is a surfman just a guy who like checks the waterline for stuff? Pretty
much. Like you're looking for the first signs of like a shipwreck. Like say if debris is washing up, if there's a body that washes up, that's normally like an eventful day for you. In this case, he finds an entire vessel. He sights a 5-masted schooner with sails set riding the sandbar on Diamond Shoal. Has to be quite the thing to wake up to. Brady put out a call for help to the nearby life-saving stations. Assistance would come from life-saving stations from various different places. Places such as Big Kenakeet, Cape Hatteras, Greed's Hill, and Hatteras Inlet Coast Guard stations. 2 lifeboats were launched, and they were able to work their way through the pounding surf to a position close to the Deering. They found her driven high up onto a shoal in a boiling bed of breakers. That's a direct quote. So it's not great. So unfortunately, due to these rough conditions, they're unable to board the vessel. They did note that there were no signs of life and the lifeboats had been deployed. Additionally, there's a ladder swinging that's hanging over the side of the vessel. All of this implies that the crew evacuated the vessel. Bad weather for the next couple days would kind of hinder any sort of fact-finding mission or any sort of salvage operation. However, on February 2nd, the Coast Guard cutter Seminole is able to maneuver within 3/4 of a mile of the wreck. From this position, they're unable to make out the name of the vessel, but they note that it is a long one. Additionally, they thought that they could make out Bath, Maine as her home port, but they couldn't be certain. So at this point, they know that it's a vessel with a long name, and they know that it's most likely from Maine. Mm-hmm. It's very interesting, just how much slower information travels at this time, and how harder it is to know something about the vessel that you're looking at.
Like the idea that they have to be able to sail up close enough that they can actually physically read it.
Right. There's no transponders. There's no nothing. There's no tracking previously. You literally have to board the vessel almost to figure out what it is.
Yeah.
So on February 4th, the Coast Guard cutter Manning is finally able to anchor nearby. She's joined by 2 surf boats from the local Coast Guard stations, and they're finally able to board and explore the wreck. They found the ship to be in fair condition, but deteriorating quickly due to being pounded by the, surf and everything. It appears that the vessel had been looted, as the ship's logs, navigation equipment, and crew's personal effects were all gone. In a classic, horror movie trope almost, there's literally food that's clearly being prepared left around, in a state of, half preparedness. So it's strange that everything's gone, but also clearly whatever happened must have happened fairly quickly if you stopped cooking dinner, in the middle of it. So that's very strange. Those things don't seem to add up, really. Mm-hmm. The Manning would attempt to salvage the Deering, but she's unable to get her off of the shoal. Ultimately, she's declared a hazard to navigation, and she's dynamited on March 4th, 1921.
I love when they have to do that. When they
it's the most American solution to a problem, right? We don't want this here. Go blow it up. The investigation into the Deering is actually launched by 5 different departments of the U.S. government. Commerce, Treasury, Justice, Navy, and State all launched their own investigations into this. Of particular note is Herbert Hoover. He's actually the Commerce Secretary at this time. He's particularly interested in this case, as there's multiple vessels from various countries that had all been lost in this general area. We say general area, we're talking a fairly large area, but kind of that general 200-300 mile radius area from that point. So, the Deering is not the only vessel lost, but it's definitely getting a lot of attention. It's of note, too, that the 2 ships that Hoover is most interested in are the Deering and a vessel named the Hewitt, which disappeared without any trace.
Yeah, it's interesting looking at that, this area and how it is kind of a big area to draw these conclusions from. But at the same time, if you look at it in perspective of global shipping lanes, this is a pretty small portion of it, and it would be very odd to be losing all these ships in this place.
Right. So the investigation would be closed in late 1922, and it's actually closed without any official findings on the accident. They basically say that we can't substantiate anything about this. So obviously, when there's no clear answer, what fills the vacuum? Speculation, rumors, all of that type of thing, right? Mm-hmm. So as you'd expect, there's various things that are flying around. On April 11th, 1921, a fisherman by the name of Christopher Columbus Gray finds a message floating in a bottle off Buxton Beach, North Carolina. It's just always so convenient when a message in a bottle shows up, isn't it?
We don't have a high opinion of messages in bottles.
No, we don't. The song, okay. The actual message in a bottle, eh.
What's this? Oh, the Sting song. I was thinking of Genie in a Bottle by Christina Aguilera.
No, I was referencing Sting. Okay. All right, so the note in the bottle reads as follows. Deering captured by oil-burning boat. Something like chaser. Taking off everything. Handcuffing crew. Crew hiding all over ship. No chance to make escape. Finder, please notify headquarters. Deering. Sort of a strange note. Again, wanting to notify headquarters. That's strange. I don't think I would write that if I was trying to get out of a situation like this. I'd be tell the Coast Guard or someone with guns.
Yeah, I guess I'd be less concerned about if my boss knows where I am.
I think it's also interesting that it was probably a publicly known fact that the vessel had requested to notify headquarters about the anchors being gone. Mm-hmm. So if you were going to write this letter and wanted to try to keep it in theme with what had actually been said, you might write the same thing, right?
Makes sense.
Well, this is where it gets interesting. The handwriting would be identified by the captain's widow as that of the ship's engineer, a man with the last name Bates. The bottle that contained the message was proven to have been manufactured in Brazil, which, if you'll remember, is where the vessel departed from. Mm-hmm. Some questioned the message's authenticity. The primary issue with it is why was the company being requested rather than the Coast Guard or some sort of other law enforcement agency. Mm-hmm. It's also interesting, though, that the captain's wife seems to think that the handwriting matches someone who would have been on the vessel. It's interesting that the bottle's from Brazil.
I thought that was interesting that the captain's wife would be knowledgeable enough about crew members on the ship's handwriting?
I would suppose, like, being like the engineer, like he's probably does do some reports or something, and everything's handwritten at the time. So
Yeah.
maybe she's just more familiar with it. Maybe she helps him keep his records or something. I don't know. It is strange that she would even think that she knows that.
I guess just as like a cultural history moment where like someone's handwriting may have been a more distinctive thing that would have been more easily recognizable.
Mm-hmm. Well, fortunately, there's some handwriting experts that work for the FBI that are a little more trained than the captain's wife. They examine the document, and they determine that it's a forgery. After this, a couple FBI agents show up to talk to Mr. Christopher Gray, and he pretty quickly admits that he forged it, with the hopes of gaining employment at the Cape Hatteras light station. That was his big plan, is to find this message and solve the mystery and get a job.
I love to do something that requires a federal agency to step in to get a job at a light station.
For this, it's like committing like a federal crime potentially for the smallest of stakes.
Yeah, I like it. I dig it.
So, as there was not a definitive conclusion in the findings, we're left with just theories about what transpires. These theories range from the plausible to the supernatural. There's a little, if you want it, it's here. The first theory, one of the ones that's put forward most frequently, is the mutiny theory.
Mm-hmm.
So Captain Wormel was known to not have the best working relationship with his first mate. The mate had previously complained about being micromanaged. You know, he said, I can't even discipline the crew without the captain getting involved. He's undermining my authority. Like if I issue an order, he'll undercut it. So not the best relationship there.
Was he a tall, thin man with red hair and a foreign accent? I'm
assuming that the mate was probably I don't know what he was. I'm assuming he wasn't a, quote, foreigner as many of the other ones were.
Right.
I think they just didn't like each other.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to figure the mate's probably also very qualified to like do most of the things the captain can. And if he can get the crew on his side, they could, pretty easily take control of things.
Right.
More support from this theory comes from comments Captain Wormel made in Brazil. The captain of another vessel also stated that he overheard the first mate in a bar and say, I'll get the captain before we get to Norfolk. I will. The first mate is drunk when he makes these statements, but he is actually arrested. Captain Wormel, however, forgives him and bails him out of jail on January 9th. So I don't know, maybe that cools the mutiny theory a little bit. Like, you get drunk, you say some stuff you don't mean, or maybe you do mean it at the time. But, if the captain's going to bail you out and everything, maybe that kind of mends that fence a little bit. I don't know.
Maybe
the first mate's just a cold calculating psychopath. Who knows?
I could follow that thread even further and be like, well, he said this when he was drunk, and then the captain heard about it, and now the captain's concerned, so maybe he's treating the first mate differently now. And then the first mate's like, well, I am going to mutiny, actually.
It's worth noting that Captain Wormel was not the original captain for this journey. The journey to Rio was actually captained by William H. Merritt. He had been a hero of World War I and had actually been cited for bravery when his vessel had been sunk by U-117 off of Cape May, New Jersey. So you're going from someone who was a younger guy, war hero, had shown bravery in saving his crew. By contrast, Captain Wormel was a retired captain with failing eyesight who had been asked to replace Merritt when he fell seriously ill in Brazil. So kind of the working theory there is that you go from working with this guy you really respect, and, even if he gives you an order you don't like, you just know that he's the kind of guy who he would do it himself. He's done it before.
Right.
You get a guy who's old with failing eyesight. If you're the mate, you're probably doing all the work. And then this guy comes in and still undermines everything you do. Mm-hmm. That's not great.
Yeah, I could see that causing some friction.
Yeah. So that's the mutiny conspiracy, is that at some point the mate led this crew of, quote, foreigners and took over the vessel. We have another theory that's really pushed by the United States Weather Bureau. That is that a hurricane sank the vessel, or almost sank the vessel, I should say. Perhaps that a hurricane was so strong that the crew abandoned ship, thinking that they were going down. They got in the lifeboats, and they're never heard from again. And unfortunately, if they had stayed with the Deering, they would have been fine, but they didn't know this. A couple problems here. Like, this would explain why food was being prepared and left, but it doesn't account for why the crew took all their stuff.
Right.
You wouldn't think you'd be taking everything with you in that scenario.
I like the idea that because you've got like 5 departments investigating this, they're all putting forward a theory that like pertains to them.
I was actually going to mention that after the next one, is that it's really curious that every department involved, the scenario that causes this incident is directly related to what their department does.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's the Weather Bureau's idea, is that they kind of needlessly evacuate and end up in lifeboats where they drown. The next option on our buffet of theories is piracy. This would be the United States Marine Shipping Board.
Oh.
So again, conveniently kind of fits something that they might be concerned about. In his opinion, Captain O.W. Parker stated, "Piracy without a doubt still exists, as it has since the time of the Phoenicians." I mean, he's not wrong. Like, the concept of piracy definitely still exists today, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's just not a lot of evidence to back this up. There's quite literally no evidence except a forged note in a bottle that backs this up. However, Captain Wormel's widow strongly advocated for this theory. And if you think about that, that makes sense. It removes any blame from the crew, any blame from the captain. It means that the captain's poor attitude and lack of like composure and respect from the crew doesn't matter. Like, you're basically removing, you're putting everything to a third party rather than having to deal with any of it. So it makes sense that she would like this theory.
You have some like sort of nameless, faceless bad guys to put this on.
Right. Speaking of nameless, faceless bad guys, another theory is that Russia/communists or rum runners were involved.
Just a shotgun blast of theories here.
Basically, just any group that the federal government didn't really care for. Basically, the idea goes that they kind of just hijack the vessel, kill the crew, and profit. I don't know. I don't know what the finale is in this theory.
Right.
It doesn't make a ton of sense other than trying to find a boogeyman to blame it on. There had been a couple stories of some like pro-communist Russian groups hijacking fishing vessels and taking them back to Russia. That is something that had happened at one point, but there's just no evidence to support that here either. It's pure speculation.
Love it. Just one of the last things that Lenin wanted to do was
a 5-masted schooner.
Was he just wanted a 5-masted schooner.
Speaking of things that can't be supported, there's also a lot of paranormal explanations that get tossed around. You know, the Bermuda Triangle often gets brought up in this. And although it's true, like technically the ship would have sailed through the Bermuda Triangle, it wasn't in the Bermuda Triangle when it was found. So I don't like, what's the statute of limitations on that? Does it follow you for a little bit? I don't know.
It picked up some ghostliness in the triangle, and that still counts.
Yeah, it's weird. You get people with all sorts of theories, everything from like alien involvement to, you know, the Bermuda Triangle, that kind of stuff. It doesn't do much for me. Not really my thing. The ocean is so much scarier than any alien story you can make up. But yeah, that is something that people talk about a lot. Is just, and you know, it is a paranormal event, right? Like in the sense that this is not the normal way something should happen.
That's true.
There is like a mystery around it that is very off-putting, that this vessel can just show up and there's no signs of distress amongst the crew, but also none of their belongings are there, but they were clearly preparing food. There's just a lot going on here, and none of it really makes sense. So obviously these kind of explanations fill in those cracks a lot of the time. So my final theory that I'll show about this one, I call it the series or a series of unfortunate events theory.
Nice.
This is my personal favorite theory, although I don't think it's the one that's most likely. It is that the crew abandoned the Deering and that they were picked up by the freighter Hewitt, which was known to be in the area. The Hewitt is the other vessel that Herbert Hoover had been so interested in.
Right.
This theory is supported by the fact that when the Coast Guard boarded the Deering, they found 2 red lights high in the rigging. This would indicate that the vessel was displaying a distress sign. As we mentioned above, the Hewitt would be tragically lost around the same time and potentially in the same general vicinity as the Deering. It is possible that the crew of the Deering, having been rescued by the Hewitt, were then later lost when the sulfur freighter disappeared. I think that would just be like such an incredible combination of events to happen that, like, you know, you think your ship's going down, you abandon it, you get picked up by a freighter, that freighter sinks with all hands, and there's zero trace of it ever happening.
Well, this is true, but we did see that in the Great Lakes Storm episode.
That's true. Yeah, I mean, there is sort of a precedent for something like this happening.
Where there was confusion about I believe it was confusion in identifying one of the ships because they're, trying to identify what ship this was because they're finding, they're finding life jackets from this other ship on these bodies, but
Right.
there's no way that this is that ship. And then they construct this idea that, well, maybe they picked up survivors from this one and then she sank herself. So yeah, I guess it is possible.
Yeah, I think that's probably like I said, that's my favorite theory just because of how interesting it is.
Mm-hmm.
To me, the mutiny thing kind of makes sense. There's just a lot of support for that.
I mean, I guess one other factor in the mutiny thing, you were talking about the switching captains and how this other captain was, kind of old and relatively infirm. I mean, if you're that first mate and you're unhappy with it and you've got this long sea voyage ahead of you, I mean, what are the odds that this old captain even makes it the whole way?
Right. And especially at this time, you could kind of just be like, oh, well, he died.
Yeah.
That's it, right? Like there's nothing else to do. It's not uncommon for that to happen during a long voyage.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, there are lots of little contributing factors, I guess, that could lend credence to the mutiny idea.
Yeah, and to me, the mutiny sort of makes sense. And especially with all those guys being, or most of those guys being foreigners, if you're a random Danish sailor, you can just go sign on to another vessel. Or if you get back to Denmark, who's going to question why you're back?
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to be like, did you randomly murder a sea captain 10 years ago? They're just not asking that question.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very interesting. I don't know. The mutiny thing makes sense to me with all the evidence of people milling about the quarterdeck for a foreign red-haired man who's definitely not the captain talking to the lightship. It definitely seems like the captain wasn't in charge.
Right.
So yeah, that is the mystery of the Carroll A. Deering. We don't have any good answers, but who knows? Maybe it's aliens. We just don't know.
Cool.
So yeah, I'll turn it over to you. Let's talk about some more legends.
All right. On our last sort of folklore-related bonus episode, we talked about keel boats and flat boats, and then we talked about the character of Mike Fink, the king of the keelboat men, the alligator horses, as they were referred to. I've got another type of folktale, tall tale here today I want to talk about, and this is Alfred Bulltop Stormalong.
Okay.
Sometimes just referred to as Old Stormalong. So we talked about Mike Fink. He's a classic American character representing that rough and tumble figure, from our American cultural consciousness, the sort of frontiersman, the sort of person that you'd aspire to be like if you were not even necessarily at the time, but sort of in the decades after that, when that was no longer really a viable career option.
Right.
But that sort of makes it something safe to dream about because you'll never have to actually do it.
Right. I mean, it's sort of the same as a Davy Crockett almost, or someone like that, right? You kind of look back to the people who settled this country and civilized it, in heavy quotes there.
Right. So Fink had a reputation for, that we talked about on the episode, of drunken aggression, frequent racism, and wanton violence.
It's safe to say Mike Fink would be canceled today.
Yes. In some later stories, he's kind of rehabilitated with a focus more on him, having a rough exterior, but deep down being a good guy. A lot of the details in his stories really demonstrate his loyalty to his men. He's a tough guy. He's a fighter. But if you're on his side, he's very good to you.
Right.
The Fink stories, they at times stray into the ridiculous, but by and large, they could be seen as exaggerations of a believable thing.
Mm-hmm.
So today I'm talking about some maritime stories that form more of a pure tall tale, more along the lines of a Pecos Bill or Paul Bunyan type set of stories. So again, these are the stories of Alfred Bulltop Stormalong, or Old Stormalong. Like many folk stories around the world, tales of Old Stormalong, they ask a classic question.
Mm-hmm.
And that question is, what if there was a really big guy?
We love big guys.
Just what if that happened? The old captain was said to be a sailor, a cutthroat, a ladies' man, and like all larger-than-life individuals, a giant. A towering behemoth some 30 feet tall.
Okay.
Or about, 9 meters?
Sure.
10 meters, I think, for our metric listeners. The man was the master and commander of a huge clipper ship, either named the Corsair or the Tuscarora.
That had to be the biggest clipper ship ever.
Very different names also there. Legend says that the ship was so tall, so immensely huge, that it had hinged masts in order to avoid catching on the moon and scratching the night sky.
I love that this is just a pure tall tale. Like, this is fun.
Mm-hmm. It is. So we see reflected in this character more of those, quote, desirable traits of early America. He's a ladies' man. He's a good fighter. He's really big. All good things you'd like if you were on the frontier.
Right.
First references to Mr. Stormalong or Stormalong John are from old sea shanties and folk ballads from the early to mid 1800s. His first appearance in like a formal print version was in the 1930s with Frank Shea's book Here's Audacity, American Legendary Heroes.
Probably had to be a great book.
As there's like still copies of it that I saw that are pretty old and beat up, but you could still acquire a copy apparently. As a newborn, when he washed up on the beach, he was already 18 feet tall.
Okay, sure.
Some iterations actually of the Paul Bunyan story sort of cross wires with this.
Really?
Of Paul Bunyan being born in, he's associated mainly with the Midwestern areas of North America.
Right.
But some of the stories kind of document him as being born on the coast of Maine. And he was so big that his parents had to keep him in a cradle in the ocean because there was nowhere on land to put him. But anyway, that's how old Stormalong starts here. He was, quote, maybe an exile from Neptune's kingdom. So maybe you could read in there this idea that American heroes all come from somewhere else.
Right.
As all of us do, or, European Americans or people who are not native to North America. And he's no exception, except he comes from the ocean.
Interesting.
Interesting part here in terms of his name and how it relates to maritime culture. And that's the Alfred Bulltop, the AB part. It's one folk etymology, folk explanation for the term able-bodied seaman. Because this is something that you do see and hear sometimes, despite the fact that the, quote-unquote correct term is just able seaman. The fact that it's written AB, leads people to say, well, what does the B stand for? And so that's where we get able-bodied from. Whereas most likely the explanation for that is that was done to differentiate on paper between ordinary seamen, OS. So you didn't write AS because that might look the same. It might be confusing.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Like in baseball, how we use K for a strikeout.
Right.
So there's that. But then one of the folk etymologies is that we use AB because of Alfred Bulltop.
Huh. It's fun. Yeah, it kind of backfills that story.
Yeah, exactly. That's even like the term for that, a back formation or a backronym. You'll see that used where we have something that exists for a reason and then people will supply their own meaning to it.
Right.
Due to folk stories or things like that. So there's some good little stories about old Stormalong here. One of them involves the Panama Canal.
Okay.
So in this story, just like our boy Mike Fink, old Stormalong is very drunk.
Okay.
And he's in a big hurry to get to the Pacific Ocean.
It must take a lot of booze to get him drunk.
Far too much of a hurry to go all the way down around South America.
Right.
So instead, he rams his ship through the isthmus and he creates the Panama Canal.
As one does.
Now, what I find fascinating about this particular story of Old Stormalong is that tall tales, like the classic American tall tale, they often do have elements of like creation myths, things like that. But it's usually for like something out of, like a geological or like a geographic formation.
Right.
Something that no one was around to actually witness. So, you'll see like how Paul Bunyan dug the Great Lakes so that Babe, the Blue Ox, could have some fresh water to drink.
Right.
Or he formed the Grand Canyon by dragging his axe behind him.
Right.
These things that like, sure, like it'd be cool to know how this came about, before we had the scientific means to know. It's very strange to see a folktale, to see a tall tale about something that is well documented and within living memory for the people writing it.
Right, yeah.
Like the Panama Canal is an extremely well documented thing, and it's just very funny to make up a tall tale about it.
That it is.
Another one is the English Channel. So in this one, Stormalong's ship, whether that's the Corsair or the Tuscarora, was so big that it once got stuck in the English Channel.
Interesting.
So to get out, his men greased the sides of it with soap to make it all slippy.
Uh-huh.
And of course, the cliffs of Dover were previously gray.
Uh-huh.
But the soap rubbing off on them turned them a bright white.
You're welcome, England.
So I think that's really funny, especially because kind of like the Panama Canal, this is like something that has been recorded for like centuries that like, hey, the cliffs of Dover are white. Like even the accounts of like Roman invasions of Britain, it's like, yes, these are white. This is a thing that we've known about forever. I just love the idea of like an American story coming in here and taking credit for the cliffs of Dover.
It has big 3-year Letterman energy on Twitter.
Because the point of this is to read too much into these tall tales that we tell. It's an interesting idea of like taking a tall tale, like a classic American story, and then sort of projecting American power overseas with it.
Right.
Especially at a time like in the 1930s when America is sort of trying to take more of a role on the global stage. It's interesting to see how that's reflected in the stories too. You know, showing that level of more global consciousness. You know, we're not just telling stories about the Great Plains or the Grand Canyon or things like that. We're telling stories about Americans influencing the cliffs of Dover.
Right. Yeah. It's something like the first American nationalism you see like projected overseas in the 30s.
Yeah. So I'm going to read a quick story here called Old Stormalong and the Octopus.
Okay.
A Rhode Island tall tale. Also, I mean, Old Stormalong's like almost the size of Rhode Island, so...
Yeah, right, I know.
Very interesting. One day, Old Stormalong, the ultimate sailor, was sailing the courser through the deepest part of the Atlantic Ocean, when a particularly large wave knocked the anchor loose. The anchor plunged right down to the bottom before the sailors could reel her in, and it got caught on something. The big ship lurched to a halt, and the sailors rushed hither and thither, back and forth, trying to figure out how to shake the anchor loose. Finally, Old Stormalong pushed the sailors aside and gave the anchor a tug himself. That anchor was stuck firm, and the sailors begged Stormy not to pull at it again, because they were afraid that he would wrench a hole in the bottom of the world and all the water would spill out into space. Some flat eartherism going on here. So Old Stormalong, he decided to go down to the depths to see if he could unhook the anchor from whatever it was tangled to. Taking a knife between his teeth, Old Stormalong dove into the water. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Then, the waters below the massive ship began to bubble and churn. The waves grew higher and higher until the ship was tossed around like a rubber duck in the bathtub. Even the old sailors grew seasick and clutched the rail, groaning aloud. After a few minutes, the waves started to calm, and then Old Stormalong popped his head out of the water. "She's good to go, boys! Hoist anchor!" he shouted. Old Stormalong climbed aboard while his men hoisted the giant anchor. As soon as they caught their breath, the sailors asked their captain why the anchor had gotten stuck on the bottom. "'Twas a giant octopus playing games down in one of the canyons," Old Stormy explained. "It took a hold of the anchor with 4 legs, and was using the other 4 to hold on to the bottom of the sea." "How did you get the anchor loose?" asked the first mate. "Well, I just arm wrestled the old whale bait until it shouted for mercy, and then tied its arms into double carrick bends. It'll take the better part of the month for all the knots to come undone." So, engaging in some animal cruelty there.
Yeah, a little bit.
Don't tie an octopus's legs together in any kind of knot. Yeah, so that's an interesting story just because of it's a creature that doesn't really feature that much in American stories. You know, we have a lot of, frequently more woodland or plains animals. This one involves an octopus, which is really cool.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Throughout the stories, so the octopus here, sometimes that story is listed as an octopus, and then in lots of stories, it involves him having like a lifelong rivalry with the Kraken. So he like fights the Kraken in like various places and times throughout his life.
It's kind of fun.
So we're going to get to the end of the story here, and that involves the death or deaths of Old Stormalong.
Plural.
The many deaths of Old Stormalong. You know, tall tales, they're not all fun and games. Some of the elements can actually be quite sad. Again, though, this reflects sort of what they're for. They very often are talking about a time that is gone and is not coming back, and that's why we're telling a story about it.
Right.
So they often do have an element of sadness to them, and it's sort of an inevitable sadness, like, because this is just what happens with time. It just keeps moving. Like, for example, in some iterations of the Paul Bunyan stories, Babe the Blue Ox, he dies. And when Paul buries Babe, that's when Paul erects the Black Hills.
Right.
To bury him, like as sort of a marker of where Babe is. It's like a very sad part of a story that you kind of associate with being like a children's story.
Right.
So in one of these death stories for Old Stormalong, Stormalong had angered a steamboat captain because he douses his boat with water because he thinks it's on fire.
Interesting.
So this is a steamboat. It's pumping out this black smoke, and of course, Old Stormalong. He's a classic sailor. You know, he's on sailing ships. He sees this steamboat. He thinks, oh, like this thing's on fire. So he dumps it. He dumps water on it, and obviously he extinguishes the boilers, and he makes the captain really upset. It's a cool element of what these tales represent of like that older world that is slowly dying. Stormalong has this kind of childishness when it comes to this new technology. He doesn't know what it is, and he reacts the way that makes sense to him. He tries to put out this fire because to him, in his, you could call it a primitive mindset, fire is a bad thing. If something's on fire, you need to put it out. He doesn't understand this modern technology.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's just like that kind of appeal to nostalgia kind of shown as like, oh, modern, like, you know, things were so much better before steamboats were around.
Yeah. So in his anger, the steamboat captain challenges him to a race. I don't know why. This doesn't really make sense to be a thing that you would do, but I guess he wants to show Old Stormalong the efficacy of steam travel and how much better it is than classic sailing. So Stormalong agrees to race the captain across the Atlantic. He does beat him just barely, but the exertion does end up killing Stormalong.
That sounds like another tall tale that I've heard of.
It's basically John Henry. Yeah. It's essentially the John Henry story. It very well could just be lifted entirely from the John Henry story, just to give, mariners something similar. But yeah, you have competing with modern technology, does win through pure, raw physical and mental fortitude, and then ends up dying just after their victory. That's one possibility. Your story had multiple possibilities. Mine has multiple possibilities.
As any good myth or legend does.
So, another option is he was sailing near Florida when a big hurricane started up.
Okay.
So he sees this happening. So he grabs as many ships as he can, because remember, he's a big man. He piles them all on top of his own to save them from the storm, and he brings them all safely ashore. So here, either God or the gods or some unnamed natural providence sends one final strong wind to carry Stormalong into the sky, because he's done this big thing. He's saved all these people, and they want to reward him with heaven, I guess.
Interesting.
One of a few people who've entered heaven alive, the prophet Elijah and Old Stormalong.
Yeah, there you go.
Apparently. Although no fire here, I think.
No fire? Well, he would have tried to put out the fire.
That's true. It wouldn't have worked.
Yeah, the fire would have scared him.
I do have one final death here. I guess the second one wasn't technically a death.
It was more of a, I don't know.
An ascension?
Ascension. I love the name of this next one.
This final one, so we know big guys have big appetites. This final death is the shortest description I've got here. One time, Old Stormalong was just very, very hungry, and he ate 6 sharks for breakfast.
Okay.
He suffered terminal indigestion and died.
Well, that'll happen in America sometimes.
Yeah, anticlimactic, but supremely American way to die.
I mean, who hasn't eaten 6 sharks for breakfast?
Eat too much meat and get indigestion so bad that you die.
It's very American.
You can do that for only $9.99 at Buffalo Wild Wings every Thursday.
Yes, you can.
So that's that. I mean, that's the story I wanted to share. For this bonus one, we wanted to do something a little bit fun. So I enjoyed those stories. They're not nearly as widely known as, Paul Bunyan or like a Pecos Bill. But yeah, they're certainly interesting about what they represent and why we tell them, and even why we stop telling them. Why is that one that isn't as well known? Why does it not relate to people in the modern world the same way that, like a Paul Bunyan character might still have something to offer in a cultural setting?
Yeah, it's very interesting.
So that's
Well, cool.
that. I think that's that should wrap up our bonus episode for this for April.
Yeah, kind of early in the month. I know a lot of times we do them late in the month. So yeah, you guys enjoy getting one a little sooner than normal.
We planned ahead and took care of business early.
We did. How about that?
Yeah. So this is fun. I think I like doing the folklore episodes. We should.
Yeah, we'll definitely come back to this. This will probably be like a running thing through the Patreon episodes. So we'll come back and revisit this from time to time. But thank you guys for being a patron, first and foremost. We definitely appreciate that. Hopefully you guys are enjoying the new sound quality with the new mics. Trying to kind of show what we're using this Patreon money for. So that's good. We appreciate it. And yeah, we'll be talking to you guys soon. Thanks for listening.